an article popped out this morning about the New York Jets, Leger, and it's detailing a lot of the dysfunction that occurred behind the scenes for the New York Jets this past season. And look, we realized that the New York Jets were the story going into the year. The acquisition of Aaron Rodgers, Hard Knocks, all of the hype and everything else built around this team, only to basically end after 4 plays for Rodgers tearing his Achilles and being out the rest of the season. And then ensued the drama as Robert Saleh tried to hold this team together. Zach Wilson came in and then out and then in and then out as the starting quarterback for this team. I know you probably haven't had time to read the entire article, but I'll just start off by saying this. You are very close to the team. Does it feel as dysfunctional as some people would say it is from the outside or some of the folks that have reported on this team?
How do I answer this bestly? And, Brady, I always try to keep it 100. I would say yes and no. Yes and no. And I say yes from this point, right? Because like you said, going into the season, with all the hype around Aaron Rodgers, we knew this was a championship defense. And for it to end in 4 plays was just ridiculous. Now, when I say yes, there was dysfunction there, was because let's not forget, throughout the whole year, when people were clamoring and yelling to bench Zach Wilson, what was Robert Saleh saying, Brady Quinn? Zach Wilson gives us the best chance to win, right? Was he not saying that every single week?
He was saying.
I think he felt a little bit under the pressure, like you talked about, right? And decided to bench him one week, and we saw it was extremely worse when other quarterbacks had to play instead of Zach Wilson. And for the longest, he's beating the table, trying to tell everybody. Well, and media pundits, most importantly, the Jets beat, we're coming out, why can't you put another quarterback in just to give a spark? Like, Brady, we know this. Like, sometimes you bring in a new quarterback, doesn't automatically mean there's going to be a spark, right? It can get worse. Right. Like, people don't understand. Like, it literally can get worse. And it got worse for the Jets. So that played into some of the dysfunction. And then they had to go back to Zach Wilson, where there was a rumor that came out that Zach was saying, I don't know if I feel comfortable. And I was the first one to come out and say this, Brady. If I was Zach Wilson, I wouldn't feel comfortable going back in there either, right? You have an offensive line that protected nobody this entire season, right? Like, it's special when you play in New York because literally your life is under a microscope more than any other city, right? Because it's the media capital of the world. Like, anything you do, say, gets blown up tenfold in the city of New York. It takes a special person to be a quarterback of a franchise in the city of New York. So Zach Wilson dealt with a lot. Now, again, did he need to get better in some areas? Yes, but he did get better from last year to this year. I think everybody was so, locked into him being the number 2 overall pick instead of looking at him for what he was, Brady. And that was the backup quarterback. Like, he was supposed to be a backup quarterback for 2 years behind Aaron Rodgers. So to me, you got backup quarterback type play from Zach Wilson. They decided to bench him, which was part of the dysfunction, and didn't have to go back to him, then bench him again, and then have to go back to him again. That was the dysfunction, right? I think a lot of it was blown out. Go ahead, Brady.
So let me just cut you off there because there's a number of things that the article kind of sorts through. And I'll just start off by looking at the top-down level approach because it wasn't just talking about the quarterback situation with Zach Wilson as the primary form of dysfunction. One of the things that touches on is the fact that Woody Johnson, their owner, seems to be constantly monitoring social media, constantly monitoring what's said about the Jets and about the team in the news. And one of the things that the article brought up too was the fact that Robert Saleh didn't feel like the Jets were handled and discussed the same way the Giants were. Because you mentioned the New York media market and how big it is and how the microscope that they're under. He kind of felt like, well, maybe the Jets were under a little bit more of a microscope, more so than what you saw with the New York Giants, even though they were a playoff team a year ago, obviously didn't have that same success. Their starting quarterback got hurt. And maybe it was because of the feel-good story of Tommy DeVito, which eventually came to the end, whatever you want to point to. But the reality is, did you feel like from this season, based on the Jets and the Giants, and I guess the lack of accomplishment in both, that it was handled the same way by the media?
I don't even think it's this season. I think it's been like that in totality. I liken it to this, Brady. This is the analogy I use when people ask me what it's like playing for both franchises, because I'm one of the few that had the unique pleasure. Me, Damon Snacks Harrison, and Leonard Williams. We all play for both franchises, which is interesting because we're all D linemen, right? When you look at the Jets and the Giants and how they're kind of portrayed in the media, to me, the Giants are portrayed as the Duke basketball team, right? Do everything right, wear button-up shirts, like everybody falls in line. And then when you look at the Jets, it's like everybody treats them like the Fab Five, right? Even the fan base is a little bit more rugged, blue collar, right? A little bit more rowdy. You know this, Brady. They're a little bit more rowdy. They go hard for the Jets.
Are you hold on for a second. Are you bringing up what was the social media discussion from this past weekend's AFC Championship game? It felt like there were some people making comparisons to the Baltimore Ravens and the Chiefs and the whole Fab
I've been on record. I've been on record to say this like years ago. I've said this.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, like, let's put this into perspective, Brady. If the thing that happened between Wink Martindale and Brian Daboll happened for the Jets, you don't think that story would have lasted for about 3 weeks? Right? It seemed like that story lasted for 2 days, and there was crazy rumors coming from the Giants of what like really happened between Wink Martindale and Brian Daboll. If that was the Jets, that would have been a story for 3 weeks, Brady. It literally lasted 2 days, and nobody's talking about it anymore. So I get what Robert Saleh is saying. Like, there's some truth to it, and you even admitted to it. Like this year, the way that the two teams recovered, there was a little, even though there was dysfunction on both sides, right? Because there was rumors that like Wink Martindale and Brian Daboll got each other's faces like multiple times. Right? Well, if that was the Jets, that would have been blown up.
I think the difference for me is that it comes with the territory, at least this season. I'm not going to look at the past decade or so or whatever it's been. Yeah. At least for this season, you got Aaron Rodgers. So, of course, you're going to have a bullseye on your back. Of course, you're going to be discussed. We're on Hard Knocks to start the season. There's already this kind of peek behind the curtains as far as what's going on. So the way I looked at it was, you got to kind of take that, what comes along with that, right? You made the decision to bring on Aaron Rodgers. This was your answer to go win a Super Bowl. And so you have to understand there's going to be more scrutiny when things don't work out. There's going to be more hype around it. And so that was more of kind of like a throwaway thing of like, all right, things not being handled the same. Well, how can you expect them to be handled the same? You're not in the same situation. If the Giants had gotten Aaron Rodgers, maybe they would probably scrutinize the same way too, because he does tend to be a polarizing figure. I think a couple of things that like stood out were the details, basically the offense, the lack of detail from Nathaniel Hackett, the fact that the offense was really built for Aaron Rodgers, which didn't really work then when it was there for another quarterback, Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, whoever you want to point to after that. Yeah. And that became one of the focal points of, do you put that on Nathaniel Hackett? Do you put on Robert Saleh for bringing in Nathaniel Hackett? Is Nathaniel Hackett basically there just because he's close with Aaron Rodgers? Probably the case. And so you start to kind of read through the article and you go, I can see how that would lead to a lack of success in the offense, even though I think we both would agree Zach Wilson got better. It talks about Zach Wilson, Aaron Rodgers relationship, how that was kind of non-existent during the period of time Rodgers got surgery, was away from the team. So there's a lot of details to the whole story of the New York Jets this season. And it summarizes, and just so we don't go too long on this one subject, it summarizes on this. And I think it was the fact that Robert Saleh couldn't really get over the media focus on their team, even after Rodgers was there. And in particular about the Zach Wilson decision and the comments about leaks and all of that. It seemed like there just was something that he couldn't get over. And his focus seemed to be more on the perception of the team as opposed to the foundation and the culture of this team. And so that's where I'll kick it to you and just ask, like, when I look at the Robert Saleh era so far, it feels like there's a lot of concern about how they're perceived, how they're viewed, and not so much about necessarily kind of building things to be ready for that moment now to take off and go win a Super Bowl. And that's really what this article details to me, at least.
We had this discussion earlier in the year, like when Nathaniel Hackett was the offensive coordinator, we were saying with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, you can kind of hide some of those deficiencies from a play caller perspective, right? But when Zach Wilson had to come in, it seems like Nathaniel Hackett didn't know how to change or call plays according to Zach Wilson's skill set. And that's why he struggled a good portion of the year. And to make this point even greater, right? And I can't believe Nathaniel Hackett even come out and said this. He was saying like later in the year, he didn't know that Breece Hall was as good of a pass catcher as he was, right? And I've been saying it all year long. I'm like, we need to get Breece Hall more involved in the pass game. I mean, Breece Hall was the number 4 guy in total all-purpose yards this year, but a lot of that came literally probably like the last 5-6 weeks of the season because they didn't get him involved in the passing game until then. So there's some of that dysfunction as well, right? And we questioned whether Nathaniel Hackett would be able to switch things up and call for the personnel that he had, because we know with Aaron Rodgers, he calls so much of the offense from the line of scrimmage. Again, like Nathaniel Hackett being there, he's the offensive coordinator, but so is Aaron Rodgers. He's another offensive coordinator on the field. So again, when you talk about Robert Saleh and people saying he was more focused on what the media, I talk to Robert like every week. Like he was focused on the players in the locker room and holding them together, because you know how it is, Brady. When you lose a guy like Aaron Rodgers, you feel like your season is over, and essentially it is, right? Because you went all in to get this Hall of Fame quarterback because you have a championship defense. And when you lost Aaron Rodgers, right, like as a head coach, you got to be able to galvanize and keep your team together. So I don't know if I agree with he was more focused on what the media was saying about him. Now, I know how that can be misconstrued because of how this article came out and how he talked about how the Giants aren't covered like the Jets. But as we spoke about, Brady, we've seen how the two teams, more specifically this year, were covered, and it wasn't on even playing field.
Yeah, and look, I understand that's your vantage point. I think from my vantage point, when you look at the season as a whole, you know, Shane Steichen, who's a first-year head coach for the Colts, they have their rookie quarterback go down. Gardner Minshew leads them into a make or break, end of the year, week 18 game to try to get into the playoffs. They didn't win it, but they still remained afloat with Gardner Minshew at a Pro Bowl year. So they found a way. The Cleveland Browns, started 5 quarterbacks through the course of the season, and were still able to find their way into the playoffs with 11 wins in a really, really tough AFC North. And let's not forget, there was 3 teams that went to the playoffs from the AFC North this year, the Pittsburgh Steelers being one of them, and clearly the number 1 overall seed, the Baltimore Ravens. So I understand what you're saying. I think the tough thing about it, and I think even for Jets fans, and I'm not trying to speak for Jets fans, but I am saying this, there's other examples of teams that lost their starting quarterback and were able to still maintain and still find ways of winning football games and get to the postseason. And I think for the Jets, to your point, as talented as they are on defense, as good as Breece Hall is as a running back, some of the other pieces, I think they're probably frustrated, saying to themselves, like, I feel like we should have been able to have somewhat of a similar run to allow ourselves to make it in there, at least as a wild card team, or have a shot at the end of the season. And unfortunately, it felt like the season was over by week 15.
Yeah, and I know we probably got to get to the next subject, but I think that was part of the issue from Jet Nation. Everybody was wondering, why didn't they bring in a veteran, right? And there was rumors that I heard that there was so much money allocated to the quarterback position already that they weren't willing to bring somebody in. Because let's not forget, Zach Wilson's contract is guaranteed as the number 2 pick. Aaron Rodgers' contract was, $50 million. Again, that could be part of the dysfunction, not, throwing more money in there to bring a solidified veteran quarterback.
Come on, Leger. Joe Flacco was just there and he was on the street. It wasn't like he's breaking.
But he's still Joe Flacco, though.
Joe Flacco took him to the playoffs. So, I
get what you're saying, too, but you also have to look at the offensive coordinator position, what we talked about, right? With Rodgers going down, was Nathaniel Hackett the guy to be able to, with Zach Wilson or any other quarterback, be able to change what he does to really benefit or really highlight the current talent that quarterback has, where we see
I would say this.
Like Kevin Stefanski
I think that speaks more, though, to than Joe Flacco's ability to learn a system, and because he's a veteran player and he's won a Super Bowl and he's been around a long time, to go in and learn it right away and execute. Because he did it with Kevin Stefanski in that offense. It wasn't like he was around. It was all new to him. He was the guy beating the Browns last year